Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander recently spoiled from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, only appearing in set and Colester boosters, Go-Shintai of Life's Origin. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Go-Shintai is a 3/4 enchantment creature shrine for 3 generic and 1 green. However, since it has an activated ability requiring 1 mana of each color, it has a Wooburg color identity. Interestingly, since Shrine is an enchantment subtype and not a creature subtype, Go-Shintai is a subtypeless creature. This means that you can have some janky interactions thanks to Volo Guide to Monsters. Since the Neon Dynasty Shrines are creatures without creature types, casting any of them will trigger Volo, giving you a token copy of it. However, since they're legendary, you'd have to also include either Mirror Gallery, Mirror Box, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, etc. in order to keep your copies around. So that's a pretty cool interaction you can take it in, especially due to Go-Shintai's triggered ability. Whenever a non-token shrine enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 1/1 colorless enchantment creature of the shrine subtype. This is crazy good since it's increasing the number of shrines you'll have in order to power up the shrines, which all care about how many enchantments you control. This commander is definitely an amazing one to put all of your shrines in, and Volo if you want to double down on the 5 new shrines since they're creatures. Since Go-Shintai's activated ability reanimates any enchantment, regardless of what it is, you can also build a very evil stacks deck with a lot of enchantments that shut down the game for everyone but not you. Imagine not being bound to stasis but your opponents are. You can sacrifice stasis at the beginning of your end step before your turn so you get an untapped step. Then you activate Go-Shintai before the end of your turn in order to reanimate stasis and keep your opponents locked out. Another evil enchantment along this vein is Decree of Silence. Each time it gets sacrificed as a state-based action for reaching a certain amount of counters, just reanimate it with Go-Shintai and really make your opponents hate you. The sky's the limit for how evil you want to be with this deck. However, I took a different approach to building Go-Shintai. Naturally, most of the shrines are in it, but I also added some of the best sagas in there as well, since Go-Shintai would be able to reanimate them after their sacrifice as a state-based action. And in order to make the most of this ability, Giganta the Wellspring is the deck's companion. Since Giganta can tap for Wooburg, you can use it to activate Go-Shintai fairly easily, just as if Sisay Weatherlight Captain were the commander of the deck. In fact, Sisay might even be a better commander for a shrine tribal deck since she can tutor for any shrine you want, particularly Sanctum of All, and then use that Sanctum to cheat in your other shrines alongside Sisay. However, while that's an amazing strategy, it might be too linear for some. And the point of this video is to showcase Go-Shintai, which is a more casual way of going about it. It's also more straightforward since you need a lot more setup with Sisay. They each have their merits, but this episode is all about Go-Shintai. Having Giganta as my companion also limits which spells I can include in the deck, which is also helpful in cutting the deck down to 100 cards. Not only that, but to also help combo off for the win, which we'll see in a bit. But first, let's start with the obvious fare, the shrines. Then we'll see which sagas I included and why. I know this episode is quite long, but I do go over each saga in great detail as well as the busted interactions in the deck that revolve around them. So if you want to see some epic ideas on what to do with sagas, get some snacks and refreshments, and maybe a notebook. Thanks to Neon Dynasty, the total amount of shrines available to the commander card pool is increased to 17. However, not all shrines are created equal. The deck is actually running 15 shrines apart from the commander, who's the 16th shrine. Let's start with the original shrines, the Honden. In my opinion, the 5 Honden are the best cycle because they don't require any mana. You do have to wait until your upkeep for them to trigger, but there's ways around that if you really wanted to. The white one can gain you a ton of life, which might not mean much depending on the commander game, so it might be the weakest of the 5. The blue one is the most busted one since it can potentially draw you into a ton of cards. It is quite costly to cast, but that's nothing to a green deck. The black one is super evil, making sure your opponents can't keep any cards in their hand. Since it is target opponent, obviously hit the one with the biggest hand first, but go for the control player first so they can't keep responses against us. The red one is a potential win con if you manage to accrue a lot of shrines. However, it can also snipe creatures with a Jurate removal. The green one might not seem as impactful, but it creates a ton of chump blockers, sacrifice fodder, or anything else you might need a lot of tokens for. Moving on to the next shrines, the Sanctums. You might notice that the red Sanctum, Sanctum of Shattered Heights, is omitted. That's because I cut it for not being impactful enough. While you can reanimate any discarded shrine with the commander, we don't need to discard lands or shrines to deal a ton of damage to our opponents. I needed cuts and it was one of them. Besides, 16 shrines is enough, especially when the commander creates more shrines. The white Sanctum is amazing because it only costs 1 to cast and can then tap down any potential commander or other attacker for just 1 white mana if we have 4 more shrines. The blue Sanctum is another card drawing Sanctum, so it can also draw us into a ton of cards. This time during our pre-combat main phase instead of our upkeep. We do have to discard a card afterwards, but that's okay. If we discard an enchantment, we can just reanimate it with Go-Shintai. The black Sanctum is another potential win con since it drains the entire table for X, unlike the red Honden which only hits a single opponent. While it might not seem like it's going to do a lot of damage, keep in mind that our commander pops out shrines itself. Plus, we've still yet to see some other tricks in the deck. The green Sanctum can add a ton of mana of a single color, which might not seem that strong in a 5-color deck. However, if you choose white, you can then sink that into the white Sanctum to tap down all of your opponent's creatures to swing in with an Alpha Strike, so it's still useful. The best of these though is obviously the 5-colored Sanctum of all. This is the one I mentioned at the beginning of the video for Sisay Weatherlight Captain. Another good shrine deck is Sisay as the commander with this Sanctum as the hidden commander. However, here is just as good. Each upkeep you can cheat a shrine from your library onto the battlefield, and if any other shrine were to trigger, it triggers an additional time, meaning double the shrine tokens for our commander. Now for the new shrines, the Go-Shintai. The white one is similar to the green Honden, but you have to pay 1 generic at the end of your turn, as with the other Go-Shintai. That being said, it's still an effective way to build up a horde of spirit tokens. The blue one is especially brutal, nightmarish art and all. While this won't mill out an opponent anytime soon, it is quite disruptive when used against decks that don't play with their graveyard. Besides, it's a 0/4 flyer for 2 mana as well, so that's good. The black one can potentially get rid of any creature if you have enough shrines, all for just 1 generic mana, so it's great to have this to also take up a slot for interaction. The red one is similar to the red Honden, but it can't hit creatures and requires 1 generic to do so. That being said, since it's at the beginning of the end step and not the upkeep, the timing is much better. The green one might seem like the weakest of the bunch or possibly tied with the blue one, but that's because it just puts +1/+1 counters on a shrine we control. That being said, putting a ton of +1/+1 counters on the flying shrine can be quite devastating against an opponent without permanent blockers, or putting them on our commander to potentially get a win off of commander damage, adding yet another win con to the deck. Now let's see the sagas I added. 12.5 shrine type enchantments currently in the commander card pool is not a large enough sample to warrant building a deck solely around them. However, I have been wanting to build a Saga commander for some time now. Given that Go-Shintai can very easily be an enchantments matters deck, I figured why not also use it to helm a Sagas deck and thus kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Go-Shintai being able to reanimate enchantments is great for getting back those sagas once they've completed their stories. Let's start with the Disruptive Sagas, which are part of the deck's interaction package. Binding the Old Gods destroys a non-land permanent an opponent controls when it enters the battlefield. However, it also does so when having its first lore counter added to it, which we'll soon see why I'm indicating that. Its second trigger has us ramp for a forest card, which doesn't have to be basic, so this can ramp for any of the 9 forests in the deck that fits the build. Its final chapter helps us out with going wide with all of our spirit tokens since they'll gain Death Touch, so all of its chapters are useful. Elspeth's Nightmare destroys an opponent's weak creature when it enters the battlefield, which can do wonders against those Pesca hate bears. Its second chapter is a duress effect, which is also good. Its final chapter exiles target opponent's graveyard. While this might seem like all of its chapters are niche effects, it's still good to have since they're all great against the appropriate decks. Fall of the Imposter has the same effect for its first 2 chapters, putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature, which is nice on our commander. Its final ability exiles an opponent's strongest creature, which is amazing, especially when we're able to reanimate the saga afterwards. Inventive Iteration can bounce an opponent's creature or planeswalker when it enters the battlefield. This is great at removing a potential blocker or resetting a planeswalker before it ultimates. Its second ability can recover an artifact, but since the deck only has 5 of them, you'll more than likely draw a card. However, there are some real useful artifacts in here, so recovering any of them is still great. Its final chapter has it exiled and then returned transformed as Living Breakthrough, a hate bear of our own. This 3/3 flyer can be quite annoying whenever we cast a spell, which is hopefully multiple per turn. Doing so can lock our opponents out of casting spells with the same mana value until our next turn. Super busted. The Eldest Reborn is especially busted since its first 2 chapters have opponents sacrifice a creature or planeswalker and then discard a card. Its final chapter then has us reanimate any creature or planeswalker from any graveyard, which is not only useful as sealing things but also reanimating creatures of our own. This one is especially spicy to reuse time and time again. The Fall of Lord Konda exiles a relatively high-costed creature an opponent controls, which more often than not might be their commander. It then returns all permanents to their owner's control, which is great in those very niche cases when an opponent steals any of our key things. For its final chapter, it's exiled and returns as Fragment of Konda, a 1/3 defender that cantrips when it dies. While that might not seem that powerful, the deck does have ways of sacrificing things for value, which we'll see later on. The Kami War exiles a non-land permanent and then bounces another non-land permanent to then have each opponent discard a card. These 2 chapters are absolutely brutal. For its final chapter, it's then exiled and returned as Okagachi Made Manifest, a 6/6 flyer with trample that has an attack trigger that can recover any non-land card from our graveyard. It is chosen by an opponent, but that's usually still a win-win. If they don't return anything we can reanimate, then we just reanimate it. If they do give us something we can reanimate, we could just recast it anyways. It then gets pumped by its mana value. Such a busted saga. The Trickster Goddess Heist exchanges 2 target creatures when it enters the battlefield. Imagine giving an opponent a colorless 1/1 spirit token or a colorless 1/1 shrine token while taking their commander or best creature. Hilarious. Its second chapter does the same but with non-basic and non-creature permanents that share a creature type. Imagine giving an opponent a fetch land they can't use and taking their command tower or other epic land. So good. Its final chapter is a nice cherry on the sundae, draining an opponent for 3 life. Reusing this saga is crazy good when we have a ton of 1/1 spirit tokens. Waking the Trolls is possibly one of the more evil sagas here since it destroys the lands when it enters the battlefield, so reanimating this multiple times with Go-Shintai is quite harrowing. If that weren't enough, its second chapter steals that land from an opponent's graveyard, or return one of our fetch lands to use again. Its final chapters has us then choose an opponent with fewer lands than us and we create a number of 4/4 Troll Warriors with trample equal to the difference. Since the deck is green, we can ramp like crazy, so more often than not, we're making a bunch of tokens with this. Speaking of tokens, the next group of sagas are all about token creation. Battle for Brettergard creates 2 differently named tokens with its first 2 chapters, which matter for its third chapter that copies our tokens for each different name amongst them. Not only is this great for all the other tokens we're making, but at the very least we can get another shrine token. Jugan Defends the Temple creates a mana dork when it enters the battlefield, which is great. It then puts a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 creatures, which is nice, but it also synergizes with its backside, Remnant of the Rising Star, on its own a 2/2 flyer. But whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, we can pay X generic to have it get X +1/+1 counters. This is no joke, especially when we're generating a ton of mana. If that weren't enough, it becomes a 7/7 with trample 2 when we control 5 or more modified creatures. Guess those +1/+1 counters do come in handy. The first Armament Games is also all about tokens and +1/+1 counters, but its third chapter can potentially draw us 2 cards. This is an amazing and cheap saga that's great to reuse time and time again. Forging the Tyrite Sword also creates tokens but they're treasures, unlike the previous saga's gold tokens. While this can help us accelerate our mana production, its final chapter can help us tutor for either Halvar or any other equipment in our library. Unfortunately, Gigantha doesn't let us include Halvar in the 99, but we can still use it to Gigantha's benefit, tutoring for Lightning Greaves. Not only that, but it can also tutor for Helm of the Gods, a stupidly busted equipment in this deck, considering that it's 38% enchantments. Equipped to Go-Shintai can easily help us do Commander Nabech knockout, but equipped to any evasive creature as well. Speaking of non-token creators that also tutor, Urza Saga is included and fortunately doesn't even take up a slot on the deck because it's a land. We do have to pay 2 and tap it to create a construction token though, and that construct won't be that strong either. However, for this saga that doesn't take up a slot on the deck, it can tutor for Helm of the Gods when it reaches its final chapter, or it can tutor for Soul Ring too. However, the real target for Urza Saga is Hex Parasite, which I'll showcase in all its glory soon. For now, I do want to remind you that, yes, you can tap Urza Saga down in response to its final trigger, giving you a colorless mana in your mana pool that you can use in your main phase, so don't forget that. Alright, now on to the boons. Michiko's Reign of Truth is also stupid good here, along the same vein as Helm of the Gods. Giving this pump to our commander or creature with evasion is golden. If that weren't enough, its final chapter has it exiled and returned as Portrait of Michiko, an enchantment creature that gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control, which is quite the beater. Triumph of Gerard is another way to put +1/+1 counters on our creature, but it's limited to our strongest creature. Same with the final chapter, giving it keyword soup until end of turn, so it is helpful for that potential commander damage knockout. While this might not seem that impacting, it's a shame that we can't run War of the Spark and the Legend of Arena unless your playgroup is fine with you rule-zooing them in, since you have to proxy them and get the okay from them, unless you work at WotC and have them. In that case, you've got this. These definitely need a little bit of playing around but can still be useful. A guy can dream, right? Anyway, now let's see how we're really going to be making the most of these sagas, since our commander isn't the only way to do so. Go-Shintai definitely cares about shrines, but this deck is mostly sagas. Thus, Satsuki the Living Lore and Atraxa Praetor's Voice are obviously included here. Satsuki is crazy here since you can just tap her down to all of our sagas get an additional lore counter. The only downside is only being able to do this at sorcery speed. If that weren't enough, she even has a super useful recovery effect when she dies. Unlike Satsuki though, Atraxa can't be activated when you want, since he triggers at the beginning of your end step. The benefit of proliferating lore counters though is that you can choose which sagas to give an additional lore counter to. You can also proliferate any of the +1/+1 counters some of our cards are spreading amongst our creatures. as well as any detrimental counters our opponents or their things have. If that weren't enough, Atraxa is quite the beater in her own right, being a 4/4 with keyword soup. Equipping her with Helm of the Gods, giving her +1/+1 counters, etc. can also be quite problematic for a hapless opponent. However, while these two can accelerate going further through a saga story by upping their lore counters to each following chapter, the previously mentioned Hex Parasite does just the opposite. For just 2 mana or 1 generic and 2 life, we can remove a counter from any permanent. Unfortunately, this won't trigger a previous chapter from a saga, but it does remove a lore counter, meaning that the next time it gets a lore counter, it'll trigger that pertinent chapter. Let's see an example of how to showcase how busted this can be. Say we have Satsuki, Hex Parasite, and the Eldest Reborn on the battlefield. When the saga enters the battlefield, it had an opponent sacrifice a creature or planeswalker. However, if we now have Hex Parasite remove a lore counter from the saga, it's down to 0 counters. We can then tap Tatsuki to give another lore counter. Since it's getting its first lore counter, it's going to trigger its first chapter again, once more having our opponents sacrifice a creature or planeswalker. And this is just one example. You can do this for as many times as you can pay with Hex Parasite. Good thing Haunted of Cleansing Fire and Sanctum of Stone Fangs gain us a ton of life. Now you'll see why Urza Saga is so good. It doesn't take up a slot on the deck, and can be used to cheat in either Helm of the Gods for a potential win or Hex Parasite for some epic synergy. Or both, since you can reanimate Urza Saga with our commander or with the second chapter of Waking the Trolls. Brago King Eternal is another way to reset our sagas. He does require getting through to deal combat damage, but fortunately you can hit an opponent without pertinent blockers. However, Brago doesn't just reset sagas by blinking them. While in and of itself that's busted as hell since you're getting all those triggers, but Brago blinking all of our non-token shrines is also busted because then it triggers Go-Shintai that many times, creating that many shrine tokens. Brago alone might be enough to really push how effective our shrines are thanks to Go-Shintai making so many shrine tokens at once. Brago is so good here. Or you could just cast either Replenish and Resurgent Belief to get all of our enchantments back onto the battlefield from the graveyard. Resurgent Belief does need to be suspended first, but you can always plan around it, especially since you know when your sagas are going to go off. Replenish is pretty costly, thanks Reserve List, so I suggest getting the gold border version of it if you don't want to proxy it or aren't playing online. Shadowgang Brothers is another way to make the most of our sagas. In response to the saga's final chapter, we can sacrifice it to these Ravnican brothers to have the entire table sacrifice an enchantment. Not only that, but we can also use them to send an enchantment to the graveyard if we want to reanimate it later. If we activate their first ability, the whole table sacrifices a creature. So if we sacrifice an enchantment creature to their first ability, everyone else sacrifices a creature. But if we do it with their third ability, everyone else sacrifices an enchantment. While Brago blinking the backside of sagas returns them back to their front face saga part, sacrificing them with Shadowgang Brothers can help Go-Shintai reanimate them back to their saga side. This creature is so synergistic here. Plus, it's amazing removal since sacrifice bypasses hexproof, indestructible, shroud, protection, regeneration, etc. Femurith Enchantress is the last card that directly synergizes with sagas. Each time one of our sagas is destroyed for whatever reason, we draw a card. So when a saga gets sacrificed as a state-based action, we draw a card. We sacrifice it with Shadowgang Brothers, we draw a card. Did we have shrine tokens die in combat or as sacrifice fodder? We draw a card. This Enchantress isn't the only Enchantress in the deck either. Argothian Enchantress, Satyr Enchanter, Sith's Harvest Hand, Enchantress's Presence, and Setessan Champion are obvious includes. While the first 4 trigger whenever we cast an enchantment, which is still a good thing, the best one is the last one because it triggers whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield. Not only that, but it also gets a +1/+1 counter on it when it happens. This creature gets huge, so drawing a card off of each enchantment being blinked and reanimated or for each shrine token created goes a long way. Joyra of the Light Captain also triggers off of most of the spells we cast since she triggers off of artifacts, sagas, and legendary spells. In this case, Joyra is like a better version of the previously mentioned Enchantress Effects that trigger off of us casting enchantments. In fact, Thought Vessel and Reliquary Tower are included precisely because of how many cards the deck can draw. While they do tap for colorless mana, the tower is the only colorless land in the deck, apart from Urza Saga, which is more saga than land anyways. And the Mana Rock is still okay to have, especially since Soul Ring is also in the deck. Mana Acceleration is still Mana Acceleration. Alright, now that we saw all the synergy in the deck and all the interaction and the reasons why these cards were included, the win cons might seem slow. Pumping up a creature with a huge boon or slowly but surely hitting opponents for damage or life loss might not seem that efficient. Yes, that does make the deck more casual, but you can still synergistically win with the remaining cards in the deck when combined together. 2 of those engine pieces are Intruder Alarm and Faith Healer. While these might seem like odd choices, hear me out. You can sacrifice an enchantment for free to the healer to gain life. This is then an enchantment that you can reanimate with Go-Shintai. Intruder Alarm untaps all creatures whenever a creature enters the battlefield. And we have the other half of the engine right in the command zone and sideboard. Let's see an example. Assuming we have Intruder Alarm, Faith Healer, Giganta, Go-Shintai, and any creature shrine, we sacrifice the shrine creature to Faith Healer. We then reanimate it by playing for Go-Shintai's ability with Giganta. Since the creature is entering the battlefield, Intruder Alarm untaps Go-Shintai and Giganta. Rinse and repeat. However, even better than this is that we have 2 triggers on the stack, Go-Shintai and Intruder Alarm. When the creature shrine enters the battlefield, have Go-Shintai resolve first, creating a shrine token. This token will also trigger Intruder Alarm. Have that trigger resolve, untapping all of your creatures. You can then tap Giganta to add Wooburg to your mana pool and use it again for Go-Shintai. Or use it to pay for the colored cost of other spells and abilities, since you still have another Intruder Alarm trigger on the stack. So this combo gets you infinite Wooburg mana, albeit for conditional use, and infinite Go-Shintai triggers, so you get infinite shrine tokens entering the battlefield. If you had Perforous God of the Forge, another enchantment in the deck, then you just killed off all opponents right then and there. The best thing about this combo is that it also works with any other enchantments if you have Starfield of Nyx on the battlefield, since it animates non-aura enchantments we control. So it can be any enchantment being sacrificed to Faith Healer and then reanimated with Giganta and Go-Shintai. Since this is a layer effect, it'll count as a creature for Intruder Alarm and trigger it, untapping all of your creatures. This combo also works with just Gen, Arcane Reaver, and Starfield of Nyx. If for some reason you can't use Go-Shintai, you can work this out with just Gen, Starfield of Nyx, Intruder Alarm, and Perforos. With a similar setup as before, just sacrifice any enchantment with Gen to return another enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield. It triggers Perforos and Intruder Alarm, untapping Gen. With Giganta, you can pay for Gen's abilities cost, thus having the infinite combo. You'll even have infinite green and blue mana left over, even if it's situational mana. However, you don't need Starfield of Nyx if you do this with any enchantment creature. You also don't need Giganta. You can either use Bloom Tender or Faber or Elder, since these will definitely tap down for the red, white, black mana needed to activate Gen. Thus, there are many ways to assemble this combo, all with cards that work well on their own, as well as having overlapping synergies. To summarize, you need either a creature that can tap down for mana to activate either Gen or Go-Shintai, Starfield of Nyx, or an enchantment creature, Intruder Alarm, and Perforos. If you're using Go-Shintai instead of Gen, then you'd need Faith Healer to complete the combo. Gravebaker Lamia is a great way to assemble this combo, in more ways than one since it's also an enchantment creature. When it enters the battlefield, it tutors for a card to your graveyard, so you can tutor for Intruder Alarm and then reanimate it with Go-Shintai. You can then sacrifice the Lamia and then reanimate it afterwards to keep filling your graveyard with enchantments. This obviously also works with Gen, and possibly much better than with Go-Shintai. Combine with Intruder Alarm and you can potentially fill your graveyard with all the cards you need, since Perforos is also an enchantment. Or get Sanctum of All to then get all of your other shrines at one time. This Lamia is just so amazing good here. Giganta might be the deck's companion, but that doesn't guarantee always having it. If someone exiles it or gets rid of it somehow, then we lose a very strong way to activate Go-Shintai. We do have the previously mentioned Bloom Tender and Faber or Elder, each with the potential of tapping for Wooburg, but the deck still needs actual mana acceleration. You can't go wrong with Farseek, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Hunting Wilds, Ranger's Path, and Skyshroud Claim. The last 5 are tied to forests, but the deck's running all Shocklands and all Triomes, plus Murmuring Bosk, so you'll definitely have lands to ramp for, which is amazing considering that they can tap for 3 colors. Birds of Paradise and Joyous Familiar are the creature-based mana acceleration. The birds can potentially help generate infinite mana when on the board with the Intruder Alarm combo out. While the Familiar doesn't tap for mana, it does reduce the cost of our artifacts, sagas, and legendary spells, which accounts for about 50% of the deck, so it's already doing some work. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 10 fetch lands, all 10 shock lands, all 5 Triomes, Murmuring Bosk, Command Tower, and Reflecting Pool, as well as one of each basic land. As I mentioned in my previous video, with how the original dual lands are climbing in value on the secondary market, I have recently taken them out of all of my decks. Since I have adopted this policy not just because of being careful when moving my cards around when going to LGSs, conventions, etc., I will also adopt this to my online deck building. So unlike all of my other deck tech videos, the converse will now be true. If you want to include faster and more expensive mana acceleration in your decks, just make the appropriate changes. That being said, if you want to add them, go for it. Commander is what you make of it, which is why it's my favorite format. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Go-Shintai of Life's origin. As I mentioned in the video's intro, there's just so many ways to build around Go-Shintai. I decided to go heavy on sagas while also included all of the best shrines because they still present routes to victory. I wanted to build the Saga Commander and Go-Shintai fit the bill for me. This deck checks off so many boxes: Enchantment Matters, Shrine Tribal, and Sagas. The video is a bit long, but that's because I go into great detail over my choices and most of the interactions in my deck. Again, this is just my way of building Go-Shintai, but hopefully I also gave you some ideas for alternate routes for it. If you're interested in the decklist of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Method Kirby, and happy brewing.